Welcome to the Veterinary Financial Podcast, where we discuss financial freedom and professional success. I'm Meredith Jones, a veterinarian and financial planner for vets.
And I'm Joe Warner, also a financial planner for vets.
Our guest today is Andrew Ciccolini. He's the medical director for primary care at Colorado State University's College of Veterinary Medicine and the co-founder of Serenity Vet. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you both. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to have a chat.
So I know you've got a lot of data that you've collected about relief vets. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about that to begin with. So how much of the private practice workforce is made up of relief vets, and has the number of relief vets grown since COVID?
Yeah, we've actually seen a pretty significant increase, even just over the last 3 years, not even the entire COVID period. We've seen a 60% increase in veterinarians that report that's their main job, being a relief veterinarian. And so we're up to about 1 in 10, so 9.6%. And that number comes from the AVMA.
Wow, that's a really big increase. Yeah, and I've noticed that too, because I worked emergency for a long time. It seems like the number of emergency relief vets has grown tremendously as well.
Definitely. And I think in the emergency space, the need is higher. There's a constant, much higher turnover that's still existing within the emergency space, whereas general practice still has turnover, but not that same COVID times where everybody was leaving their jobs, but the emergency space still has a higher need for relief vets. And so you tend to see more relief vets there.
Is that a lot of times where practices look for relief vets is in times of turnover and things like that in general?
Yeah, I think there's different times they could look, and that's definitely one of them. So if they have someone leaving, I think the numbers are getting better, but for a while there, it was taking about 8 to 10 months to find a replacement. I don't know exactly where that's at now. I think it's shortening a little bit. So if you go that long with no veterinarian to cover your cases, you're going to start losing clients. And so relief can be a gap to help prevent that loss while you're waiting for a new person to come on full time.
Yeah, it's kind of a cool opportunity for both clinics and also veterinarians, which is probably why there has been such a big increase. And 60% as like their main job, that's a really large number. Why do you think that has increased so much over just the past few years?
I think there's a large number of reasons. The first is I just think it's a lot easier to do now. The barriers to entry are a lot less. It used to be you had to do everything on your own to become a relief vet. You had to find all the clinics that had a need. You had to negotiate your own contracts, set up your own billing, and it was just a lot more work. And now there's a lot of different agencies and companies and platforms out there that can help support a veterinarian becoming a relief vet. And then I think the lifestyle of relief vet tends to attract people. You get a lot more autonomy, control over your schedule, find those clinics you like, and you can work with them. And if you decide you don't like a clinic, you can just move on. You're not beholden to any contracts. And the pay tends to be a little bit higher. There's certainly a lot more that goes into it than just pay, but that does tend to be a draw for people.
Yeah. And what are some other reasons that you have seen vets transition to like full-time relief versus just doing relief on the side?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they just need a change. They want to do something different for a while. And maybe they've been, in full-time practice for a number of years and they want to take a break and try something different. And relief allows them to stay connected to the skills that they've built and maintain some income. Sometimes they just decide, they actually like that as a full-time career and that becomes their new gig. And sometimes it's just a bridge until they want to get back into full-time work. Maybe something in their life caused a change. They had a kid, they moved, and it's a good way to just kind of put your foot back in, have that control over your schedule, maybe work part-time until you're ready to take a part or full-time role. A lot of people will use relief work as a way to kind of assess a clinic to see like, hey, is this a place I really want to work full-time? We see a lot of people will eventually stop working relief and take a full-time role with a clinic that they worked with as relief.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, we've interviewed Cindy Trice on this show before, and she put that as like, oh, well, some vets, they want to try before they buy, so.
Absolutely. And for the clinics too, like it's nice for them, like an interview only does so much, and like a working interview for one day is hard to assess whether they really fit into your culture. But if they work with you as relief, they get a feel for your staff and your workflows, you'll get a good feeling if they're a good fit and vice versa for them.
Yeah, totally. And that I always think too, just through my wife as she's a veterinarian and just the reasons that like she thinks about, she does small animal GP, but thinks about like relief is a lot of the things that you kind of mentioned where it's like being able to try like a new area of vet med or different clinics, things like that. Those are like a lot of the pros, I guess, of relief work. What are some of the challenges that relief vets face?
Yeah, I think there can certainly be a few. And I think the one people think of the most is just like the lack of benefits. So when you're working as a W-2 employee for a company, usually, you're getting paid time off, or depending on the practice, you might be getting health insurance and contributions to your retirement funds. And that tends not to exist as a relief veterinarian. And so you have to manage that all on your own. And you have to factor that into your financial planning. If your plan is to work 3 days a week as a relief vet and your goal is to make X amount of dollars, are you planning to work 52 weeks out of the year, or are you going to take some vacation in weeks where you're not going to be working because nobody's going to pay you paid time off? You need to plan for your own retirement. So those are some of the challenges. Income variability can be a big one. So relief work can be inconsistent, especially in certain areas. And so you have to kind of plan ahead and be ready for those gaps where maybe a week or two goes by where you don't have any relief work. And that can cause some stress for some people. There's also a big one is just like professional isolation. And so if you're bouncing around from clinic to clinic, it can be a little bit harder to develop those relationships that I think are really important to what makes veterinary medicine so great. And so we even saw that in our survey, which I think we'll get into later, but just that feeling of isolation can exist for relief veterinarians and a lack of connection to other people within the field.
Yeah, and that certainly makes sense. And burnout certainly is a common problem among veterinary professionals in general. And so I know you've got this white paper, this Burnout in Relief Veterinary Practice white paper. And so I'd love to hear more about that. And then also just hear what are some of the common burnout drivers for relief vets.
Yeah, so Serenity Vet partnered with Talkatoo, which is an AI scribe software, and Galaxy Vets, which is a network of hospitals mostly within Canada. And we did a survey on burnout specifically with relief veterinarians. And we found that since 2022, that burnout scores actually increased by 25%. And, a couple of those drivers of burnout, the number one thing reported by about 35% of the relief vets is overcommitting to shifts. And that comes back to that income variability. If I'm not certain I'm going to have enough work, I'm going to take any shift I can get when they're available. And so people tend to overcommit. And then number two was unpredictable income, which contributes to number one, like we just said. And then the third most was just tax and administrative burdens. So the additional work that essentially feels like you're not getting paid for, right? Because it's all the stuff you have to do on the side when you're not working in the clinic can contribute to burnout. And then the fourth being lack of community, which we touched on already, that it's not just something that I've experienced, it's something the entire community feels. And so that tends to affect burnout. And then the lack of structure was the fifth most common thing reported from relief vets that causes burnout, just not having a consistent schedule and having to be much more adaptable.
When you think about, you had mentioned unpredictable income and things like that, do you see that being different in different areas of the country? And I guess you could talk a little bit more on that specifically.
Yeah, I don't know if we quite parse that out in the data in terms of different areas of the country, but I can tell you from my work with Serenity Vet and being a relief vet myself, there are still pockets of the country where relief vets have their pick of the litter. They can get shifts whenever and wherever they want. And then there are some markets where it's shifted and it's super competitive and it's harder to find shifts. I live in Colorado and we don't have a shortage of vets in Colorado, at least in the Front Range where the vast majority of people live. And that affects relief veterinarians, and it's really hard for them to find shifts. But if I flew to, say, San Francisco, there's still a shortage of vets there, as far as I can tell, and there's constantly a need for relief vets, and I'd have no problem finding work there.
Yeah, so let's dive into some of these burnout drivers in more detail. And so the overcommitting to shifts, that's your number one. That's also the number one that I see with clients that we work with is just, I think that comes from a few different areas. Like, yeah, they're worried about the finances, worried about, okay, am I going to get enough shifts, or, just kind of having, potentially a scarcity mindset associated with just not knowing if there's going to be enough work for them. But then it's also just people pleasing behavior as well, So
I'm really glad you brought that up because you're a vet, so too. I just think that's our profession. Like, we're a caring bunch and we see a need, especially if it's a clinic we've worked for before. So we want to help them out. And so we feel that pressure to say yes. All those other factors are a big part of it too. But I think it's important to consider the human component of we want to be helpful and we want to help pets. And so we tend to sacrifice ourselves for others.
Yeah, and that's I did a talk a few years ago that was it was targeted to relief vets, and it was about how to take a sabbatical. And I talked about overcommitting to shifts, because one of the things that I see with new relief vets, especially like full-time relief vets, is they'll say, oh, well, I want to do this because I want to travel more, or I want to do this because I want to be with my family more. And I see varying degrees of success with that. Yeah, sometimes they think they want to travel more and they end up overcommitting to shifts instead. So
yeah, it's great in theory. And we definitely do have travel relief veterinarians that will go to different cities and states and whatnot and do some work and then also spend some time there. But it's challenging to do it that way. And I think we all fall into the same trap of, oh, I'll work these shifts now because they're available. And, I'll take my vacation in 2 months, and then it turns into 3 months, and then it turns into never.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And then another thing you brought up was the administrative work and thinking about taxes. And of course, taxes are something that's often overlooked for people who are new to working 1099 and making sure that you're setting money aside and paying quarterly taxes and things like that. And then the other thing that's interesting as a phenomenon that's very, very common is, okay, I'm not working unless I'm in the clinic. That's the mentality for almost every clinician, right? But if you're full-time relief, then it's almost like you're a business of one. It takes time to run that business.
Absolutely. You have to factor that in when you're considering the income. I think a good comparison is like those people that own their own practice. They own a 1 doctor, 2 doctor practice, and they go to sell and they've never paid themselves for all the administrative work they've done. And now they're looking to sell, and the person buying is like, okay, but you're not paying someone to do all this work that you are doing. And so you're actually not as profitable as you think you are because you just never paid yourself. Then it catches up with you. And it's the same on the relief side. You have to consider that as hours worked and factor that in. If you're looking at it on a per hour basis, you really need to factor that in to know how much you're truly making.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess in terms of that, where you talk about there's different ways that vets approach relief work, whether that's like working directly with clinics or some other way, I guess, what are you seeing as like some different structures or avenues that veterinarians are taking for relief work?
Yeah, so I think there's people that work relief as like a side gig, so they pick up a few shifts here and there. There's people that do it part-time, and we talked a little bit about that. Maybe they're just stepping back into the waters. Maybe they're taking a break, or they're doing it full-time. This is all they do. And then they have a couple different routes they can take of how they manage that, which I think is what you're asking. And the first being kind of the old school way of doing everything yourself, finding those relationships, working with the clinics, seeing what their needs are. There's still a lot of people that like to do it that way, but then they do take on all those administrative burdens. And then there's companies where you can essentially sign up as a W-2 employee. So you're guaranteed a salary. They often come with some of those benefits that we talked about being a downside to relief work. And they essentially negotiate all the relief work for you and tell you where to go and when. So there's some benefits to that because you're getting more guarantee in terms of revenue, but you lose some of that autonomy. So that's kind of the drawback. And then there's essentially the marketplaces. So like Serenity Vets works at partially as a marketplace, kind of like the Uber of vets. And I think that's what's made it much more accessible is, you can log in and you can see all the shifts available and you can apply to them, and you kind of like have that autonomy. You can manage everything yourself. You're still a 1099. It doesn't come with the benefits, but there's a lot less legwork to make it happen. And we're seeing a lot of that these days, people working in that space.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I saw something the other day about Serenity Vet, and it said that you could set your own rate. Is that a thing?
Yeah, and so that was actually kind of like our initial thesis of how we started, was our own frustration from like mine and my partners, like clinics, like not being able to decide what we wanted to pay the relief veterinarian and what made financial sense for that individual clinic. And so that was the kind of the first thing we led with, was the clinic gets to offer whatever rate they want based on their financials, and we provide financial data to help them make those decisions. For example, we provide what the average rate in that area is based on the type of shift. So if it's general practice, urgent care, ER, just to help guide them. And then we have a profitability tool where they can put in kind of their financial information within their practice to know what they can actually really afford to pay and still maintain their profit margins, or at least be close to it and not lose money. And on the veterinarian side, they can still negotiate if they see a shift that's posted at, say, a rate of, $1,200 for a 10-hour shift, and that doesn't quite match their needs. They can still apply for that shift with a little bit higher rate, and the clinic can decide if they want to accept that. But we don't dictate any prices on our platform when it comes to the shifts.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, because I think for relief veterinarians that are kind of on their own and like looking for those shifts, that seems to be like a really big component, is like, how do I negotiate that? And then also on the clinic side, like when they're hiring relief vets, like what makes sense as far as like a pay structure or how they want to pay those vets. And so that's cool.
Yeah. And from our survey, we saw that 1 in 3 relief vets kind of struggle with that negotiating and like developing a rate. I think it's very similar to like when we're having to essentially sell our medical services. Like we hate talking about that money piece to clients, and we hate it just as much as a relief vet. So we offer some of the same tools on the veterinarian side for Serenity. So that average rate in the area, we just recently released it on the vet side as well. So they can see when they're negotiating that they're don't feel like they're getting taken advantage of. They know what the appropriate rate is. And then 2, they don't have to fear necessarily over asking and their shift being declined, because we did see that sometimes before we implemented it. It felt like vets would just guess a rate and it would be too high and the shifts would get declined. And so we tried to provide more data for people.
Oh, yeah, that's super helpful, because that's something, because I run the Debt Free Vets Facebook group. That's something that I'll see commonly, as somebody will come on and they'll say, oh, well, how much do relief vets charge in this area? And you see it on other Facebook groups too. And sometimes people just don't know, and they don't necessarily want to talk to or don't know the relief vets in the area as well.
Yeah, it can be hard. I mean, it's not something I'm super comfortable with. I'm not going to lie to you. Like, I don't really like negotiating rate. I have that same, what we talked about earlier. I just want to be helpful to the clinic. And so I'm like, I'm just happy to be here, but I also got bills to pay. So
you have to get paid for sure. So I love that. I guess not just in terms of negotiation specifically, but just in general with relief vets, what are some of the biggest tips that you would have for any vets that are looking for relief or doing relief to be successful?
Yeah, I think the number one tip is what you all talk about all the time, and that's put together a financial plan. You have to have a plan. You can't just go into it and be winging it, or you're probably going to get burnout. You're probably going to get really stressed out. So really sit down and figure out, what does your plan look like? What do you need to make this work? And then start figuring out how you get there. But that's the number one thing, is starting with a financial plan. And you all could teach much more about that than I could.
No, I love that. I think when we talk about like financial planning, a lot of times that like confidence in your financial plan usually comes from knowing that there is a plan to start with. And so that's usually like step one for how to be successful. So I think that's great. And I love how that also just applies to the veterinary relief space as well.
Definitely. And, I think once you have that plan together, from there, it's really important to set boundaries. And that doesn't just mean set boundaries with like the clinic. That means with yourself too. You have this plan, try to meet it and set the boundaries that help you be within there and not necessarily go outside of it. And that's how you end up overcommitting to shifts. As we talked about, that's the number one reason for burnout. So don't do it to yourself, try to avoid that. But of course, boundaries with the clinics as well. I do often see clinics will pressure the veterinarians to do more and do procedures or things they're not comfortable with. And every time that I've consulted with a relief vet faced with this situation and encouraged them to push back on it, the clinic was fine with it once they really understood what their reasons were, what their comfort level was. And it always turned into a good situation. So don't be afraid to say like, that's just not something I'm comfortable with. And at the same time, another way to be really successful as a relief vet is to continue to grow your skills. On the clinic side, their expectation for a relief vet coming in is that you can work pretty independently. You're a fairly experienced veterinarian. So the more skills you build, the more value you can provide. And as the market continues to shift and relief work becomes more competitive, the more value you can provide to a clinic, the more stable you'll be in that field.
Yeah, I love that. I think those are awesome tips. And I think, and you said like continue to grow your skills. And it seems like relief work is just a good way to do that too, because you can focus on like the areas that you want to when you're doing that. So you've talked a lot about like relief and you've had a lot of really good information around like the white paper that you had published as well. I guess, how can the listeners for the podcast connect with you?
I think there's a number of different ways with Serenity Vet. If you're interested in relief work, you can just go Google Serenity or just type in the website serenity.vet. For me personally, I run an Instagram account called OKVet, which I'm quite active on. And just being the vetfluencer, it tends not to be particularly serious content. It's mostly intended to be fun, but occasionally, I put some educational pieces in there. And so I'd love to have anyone from the community connect with me there if they don't already. On a professional level, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Okay, Andrew. So that brings us to our last question. What is your best advice for our listeners?
Yeah, so my best advice is related to my social media account, and I share this with people all the time, and it's be okay with being okay. There's so many demands on us in this profession, especially if you're in the general practice space. And this isn't just veterinarians, it's veterinary technicians, managers, anybody that works in the field. Be okay with being okay is just my philosophy of avoiding burnout. It's just impossible for us to be great at everything that we're asked to do. And so find those areas that you have interest and where your strengths lie and really lean into it and be the best at those. And then the other areas, just be okay with being okay. You'll find it's such a much better way to live your life when you just accept we can't be great at everything.
All right. Be okay with being okay. I love it.
That. That's awesome.
Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I always enjoy talking about really just veterinary medicine in general and connecting with people in the field. You both have been connected to it for a long time, so I enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks so much for listening. My mission is to help you take control of your finances and build the life you envision. If you'd like to see how financial planning can support your goals, visit allvetfinancial.com and click the Book Now button to schedule a free intro call. Until next time, take care and continue your path to financial success. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered individualized financial advice. If a specific investment is mentioned, it should not be considered a recommendation or endorsement to buy or sell the investment. All investments involve risk. Past performance does not guarantee future results. You are encouraged to seek the advice of a financial professional before implementing any investment strategies discussed. Yay, compliance.